So welcome to the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Condition seminar, colloquium, and we are very happy to host today our own postdoc, Asaf Mond, who defines himself as a scholar of the total war, wartime urbanity, and concentration camps. He wrote a book on concentration camps in liberal countries during the Great War. Asaf earned his PhD at the Tel Aviv University, Tzvi Avid School of Historical Studies. He was a postdoc at the Open University, and as I said, he's now, we are fortunate to have him as postdoc at the Minerva Center. And his talk today will be on what to expect when you are expecting civil rights, thoughts on urban history, production of space, and law. Asaf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eli. So I'll share the screen. Great. So, hi, everybody. I wanted to use this platform of this talk today to present the core of my study, I guess, in recent years, both from researches that were already developed for publications and those that are being written these days, literally these days, and those that are still in their archive stage. And just let me press here, okay. So, at the beginning, I will say a few words about spatial history as part of the spatial turn, and then I will demonstrate the benefits of spatial history using stories of three people from three different articles I worked on or parts of books that I worked on or am working on. The first one is Rudolf Rocker and the First World War concentration camp in Alexandra Palace in London. The second one is Nathaniel Lynn Moore and the Second World War Masra Detention Center in Akko. And the third one will be the 14-year-old Kathleen Biddlecombe, who moved with her parents to the newly built housing project in London during the First World War, going back to the First World War. Sorry. But I want to start maybe with something most of you can relate to in a much more easy way. And I'll tell you that until several months ago, my wife and I lived in Givatayim. And our daughter was born on May 2019, which means that when at the outbreak of the coronavirus, the outbreak of the pandemic, she was about 7 or 8 months old. And then it started to change everybody's life. And sorry, and when she was about 10 months old, the lockdown, the first lockdown, was enacted. And you probably remember that as part of the first lockdown, we were not allowed to get away for more than 500 meters from our homes. And so my daily walk with my daughter in the baby carrier were restricted. And we could not have gone to the park in Givatayim anymore. And I found myself investigating small streets within 500 meters radius from our home. Sometimes, I don't know, stealing a few dozen meters just to get to more interesting places. This is me and my daughter during the first lockdown. And that was my daily routine for a few weeks, those several small streets near my home. And the lockdown ended, and then we stopped going through these streets and returned to walk in the park with her. Today, my daughter is almost 3 years old, and she's running around all the time, and her baby carrier days are ancient history. And we don't even live in Givatayim anymore, but my father still lives there. near in the same street that we used to live. So, and I get together every once in a while. And every time I'm there, I pass this assemble of streets, which were part of these walks during the first lockdown. And I realize how important those streets are to my memory of the lockdown days and to the whole pandemic experience, at least for me. And I find that really interesting because I'm a scholar of spatial history, which means I study the interactions between space and people. And I find specific interest in the relationship between space and the concept of crisis. Now, my goal in my recent studies is to understand how spatial analysis can enrich our understanding of the crisis, the larger thing. And when I implemented this prism of thought on my own life, I understood how the coronavirus was, for me at least, and probably for many others, a very urban crisis. And it probably played a major role even in my wife and I's decision to move north, to live in a kibbutz in the north. So in our experience, of course, the pandemic was a health crisis, maybe a bit of an economic crisis, but it was also a spatial crisis with spatial implications, and we cannot fully understand this crisis without looking at it from also the spatial prism. So needless to say, this is a very simplistic conclusion, not too sophisticated, but I thought it would be good to open with it today just to get you in the right mood for the rest of the presentation. Because I want to talk with you today about spatial history, about spaces in times of crisis, and about the expectations of people from the space they live in, and the way the crisis change or even shapes their spatial experience. And of course, about the ways the space shapes their experience of the crisis. So, this sort of work belongs to what is known as the spatial turn in the humanities and the social sciences, which happened about 30 years ago. Basically, it challenged, the classic definition of history as change over time. History, change over time. Now, temporality, the concept of time, is of course still the heart of the discipline of history. But the spatial turn adds the concept of space to this equation. As one scholar of space called it, social and cultural life do not happen on the head of a pin, but are thoroughly spatial. And as other scholars refer to it, geography matters not for the simplistic and overly used reason that everything happens in space, but because where things happen is critical to knowing how and why things happen, why they happen. And with that in mind, let's go from my strolling through the streets of Givatayim to the strolling of Rudolf Rocker through the streets of London. So, on the morning of 28th of May, 1915, several months after the outbreak of the First World War, Rudolf Rocker, the man you see here, he reached the tube station of Wood Green, London. Now, before the war, Rocker lived for many years not very far from this station, in the district of Mile End, with his wife Millie and his two sons. I think they were called Rudolf and Fermin, yes. And he worked as a bookbinder and was part of the East Ham Jewish very lively community. During his 20 years of residency in London, London became his house, his home. And so in his memoir, he wrote with great affection about his ride on the Underground during that morning. He writes, I'll show you the quote, "The sight of the familiar London streets moved me tremendously. Okay, sounds like a regular trip in the tube. But Rocker was not alone in this specific trip. He was accompanied with several other civilians of enemy origin, and the British policemen who watched they are not trying to escape, basically. He was in the city that he lived in for 20 years. He rode the tube like he used to, but he was no longer part of the civilian life in London. This was the first year of the First World War. And that was May 1915 was the time that after a very heavy public pressure that started at the beginning of the war, the British government decided to intern all the civilians of enemy origin in Britain. Most of them were German, like Rudolf Rocker. And in other words, if you were German, Austrian, even Bulgarian, you were imprisoned in one of the temporary internment camps in Britain without trial, no verdict, of course, no release date. It was not even said that you will be released when the war is over, and indeed, most of them were only released several months after the war was over. The decision to intern all civilians of enemy origin was possible because of two famous and important legislations from the early days of the war. The first was the Alien Restriction Act, which was introduced by the British government on 5th of August 1914, a day after the declaration of war by Britain. But it wasn't like it took one day to present this law. It was based on previous governmental work about the question of treatment of aliens during a time of war. And according to this new act, civilians of enemy origin were not allowed during the war to enter or leave Britain without permit, and they had to register immediately at the local registration office, which was usually a police station, and those who did not register were fined. Now, these restrictions might not sound too severe, perhaps they even sounds reasonable, but they are the first special restrictions on civilians of enemy origin during the war. The second important legislation was the Defense of the Realm Act, which was also presented in August 1914. The Defense of the Realm Act, which is usually known by its abbreviation DORA, D-O-R-A, was broadened and amended several times until the end of the war in 1918. And it was enacted to compromise individual liberties in the interest of public safety and defense of the realm, of course, such large words. And thus it allowed the police, for example, to arrest a person just for acting suspiciously. It even included the permission to arrest someone just for having a homing pigeon. And DORA, Defense of the Realm Act, is the symbol of the civil rights deprivations or limitations during the First World War in Britain. There's probably no need to explain to this crowd about the complications with such laws. And I guess some of you, or most of you, studies such laws and the ways they are legislated and implicated. I personally do not have most of the professional skills to do so. I am a historian, sadly, who study the interactions between people in space, as I said before. And what I find interesting in these laws and in the later decision from May 1915 to intern civilians of enemy origin is the special crisis within the larger crisis and what we can learn from it about the expectations of people from their space. So let's go back to that morning on 28th of May 1915 and to Rudolf Rocker's journey in the tube. And I quote from his memoir. He writes, he wrote, "We soon reached Wood Green and got out. We marched slowly up the hill that is topped by the building known as Alexandra Palace. This was our new internment camp." What you can see in this photo is, you can guess the route Rocker took with his fellow internees from the tube and up the hill to Alexandra Palace. I walked it myself. It's a nice walk. It's London, so it's a nice walk. And maybe perhaps this in this photo you can better see the isolation of the palace from the rest of the city. It is located on a hill, isolated and excluded from the rest of the city. For Rudolf Rocker, this walk from the tube up the hill and to the palace, it was an act of a transformation. Down the hill, he was riding the tube like a Londoner, like a civilian, and at the top of the hill, when he reached the top of the hill and to the palace, he was an internee, he was a prisoner. Down the hill, he was part of the civil community. At the top of the hill, he was an enemy of his fellow Londoners. He was an enemy for those who he used to live with and worked with and everything. Down the hill, he was at the home front. At the top of the hill, he was in a space of war. He was behind the barbed wire, and armed soldiers guarded from his attempts to escape. And I'm interested in this moment in time because of its spatial importance, because it's a beautiful example of the interaction between people and space, especially in times of crisis. The transformation of Rocker from civilian to prisoner, it represents one of the key characteristics of being an internee, which is spatial violence. Andrea Peter, who wrote a great book about the global history of concentration camps, she explained that nearly all concentration camps extract people from one area in order to house them somewhere else. And it might sound a bit, I know, obvious, but what I found in it is a reinforcement to my claim that Alexandra Palace should be referred to as a concentration camp and not as an internment camp. And therefore, it should be part of a global history of concentration camps. It is a long argument, and I wrote about it somewhere else, which will be published 4 months from now, I think. And I don't aim to be provocative, and I do not argue that there were no differences in the levels of physical violence enacted against prisoners in Alexandra Palace or places like Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. But without getting too much into details, I do want to say that it is important to give this example of the way one changed from civilians to a prisoner in a concentration camp, and the importance of his own version, his own experience for my analysis as a historian more than 100 years later. And as you can see again from this photo, the separation from the city, the exclusion from the urban space and into a space of war is vital to the understanding of the essence of the camp. Now, from the First World War camp in London, in Alexandra Palace, and the research that I already finished with, I want to go to a Second World War camp in Masra, near Akko, which I'm working on since the beginning of this year, at least. Okay. Masra detention camp was established by the British mandatory government at the outbreak of war in 1939, and it was closed by the end of 1942. It wasn't open for too long. It was located west of the Palestinian village Mazra, south of Nahariya, and on the beach of the Mediterranean Sea, next to the old city of Akko. The prisoners in this camp were of different sorts and were separated for several sub-camps. Some of them were, in a way, like Rudolf Rocker in Alexandra Palace. They were civilians of enemy origin. They were called the internees in the camp. For example, those were the German Templars who lived in mandatory Palestine, and even before that. Some of them were convicted felons, and for them, this camp was basically prison. Some of them were Jewish illegal immigrants, and they are a different story altogether. But the rest were detainees, Palestinians and Jews who opposed the British mandate in Palestine, and they were, in essence, as they saw themselves, political prisoners. They were imprisoned under the emergency regulations, which were authorized by the British High Commissioner in Palestine. And in many ways, they were like civilians of enemy origin, internees, because they were kept there with no trial and with no actual release date. The main difference between them and civilians of enemy origin was, at least those who I spoke earlier about, those who were in Britain, is that the mandatory Palestine was not really a liberal state, despite the long British heritage of liberalism. It was a different sort of geopolitical entity. And the Jewish people in the Yishuv who opposed the British mandate did not recognize the legitimacy of the British holding of the land. And therefore, they did not really expect their liberal rights to be kept by the British officers, unlike Rudolf Rocker, who, as a civilian, as a resident of London for more than 20 years, he expected his civil rights to be kept. But again, we are here to discuss spatial history and the ways in which it enriches our understanding of the crisis. So let's see how the Mazra detention camp was described by one of the prisoners there, Nathaniel Inmore. Yelin Mor was one of the leaders of Lehi, the revisionist and terrorist organization. He was imprisoned in Mazra on the spring of 1942, and he was kept there until December 1942, basically when the camp was closed. And then he was moved to Latrun detention camp. He's a bit famous for, among other things, for organizing the great escape from Latrun through a tunnel. But that's a different story altogether. And this is what Yelin Mor wrote in his memoir about his first encounter with the Mazra detention camp. That was Mazra camp. A few dozen long wooden huts with tin roofs, groups of huts separated by barbed wire. The camp is built on a complete flat plain, boring. So, but then he writes more, but not too far from the last line of huts, over the barbed wire, one can glance at the great sea with its deep blue color, with its dancing waves in front of our eyes. How can one be bored? Oh, sorry, didn't, okay. How can one be bored in front of this sea, the most beautiful sea in the whole world? And then, after he wrote such nice words about the camp, the space of the camp is loaded with another layer of meaning, according to Yelin Mor. And this is how he writes about what he sees in the camp. He writes, "This is our sea. No one will take it from us, not even the foreign government. It is worth fighting just for the sea alone, so that we can walk freely along his shores. so that anyone who wants to can come here through it. Anyone. Now, Yelin Mor wrote about the sea, so this is the sea that Yelin Mor saw. Try to overlook the beautiful family of Inspector Michael Higgins, who was the commander of Masra detention camp, and thanks to his photograph, we can actually see the camp and the sea, but try to focus on the proximity of the camp to the sea, how close it was. So when Yelin Mor came to Masra, he was still very much under the impression of, a strong impression even, of the news about the sinking of the ship Struma, with its nearly 800 Jewish refugees. Yelin Mor blamed the British for the disaster, since they did not allow those illegal immigrants, Jewish illegal immigrants, to enter Palestine. They escaped Europe, they tried to come to Palestine, and the British refused their entrance. They were later, the ship sank not because of the British, because it was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine, but that's a different thing. And the voyage of Struma to Palestine was organized by the Irgun, Etzel in Hebrew, and almost all of the Jewish prisoners in Masra were either members of Etzel or members of Lehi, like Yelin Mor. And Yelin Mor and other leaders of the Lehi founded the Lehi after they split from Etzel. So basically it was, they have some shared ideology. We do not know what was the personal experience of every prisoner in Masra. We do know what Yelin Mor told us about his own personal experience. And from his words, we can learn about the importance of the spatial prison to the analysis of the everyday life in the camp even. Because the importance of Yelin Mor, the imprisonment of Yelin Mor and his fellow Etzel and Lehi members did not happen on the head of a pin, as Creswell wrote. It was thoroughly spatial. And when I spoke with Nathan's son, Elisha, he told me how much the time he spent in Masra detention camp, how much it meant to him, how much it helped to shape his public figure. He became a member of the Knesset later, but how much it was important also for him as a member of Lehi. And this sort of analysis can explain that. It can enrich our understanding of the importance of the experience of imprisonment. The Masra detention camp was not excluded from the place where it was located, but rather it was part of it. It was very close to the sea which symbolized for many of the prisoners the raison d'etre of their fight, the same fight that was the reason to begin with for their imprisonment. And now I'll go to the final part of this presentation, the third and final one, and back to the First World War, to the story of a 14-year-old girl. Just a second, okay. So this is Kathleen Biddlecombe, she's the one in the middle. We will talk about the diary she wrote on 1918 when she was 14, and in this photo she's 8 years old in the middle, so it was probably around 1912. And this is what she wrote in her diary on April 26th, 1918. Took Mary with me shopping today. It was a wrecked morn, but at noon it gave way to lovely sunshine. An air raid warning was announced late last night. Beautiful night for a raid tonight. Now, to better understand those few lines, we need to take a closer look at Kathleen's surroundings, the space she lived in. And I will try to do so briefly as possible. Kathleen lived with her parents, sister and brother, in 6 Cobbett Road, Eltham, in a housing project which is was known then and known until today by the name Progress Estate in the London district of Greenwich. This is the house as it was preserved. Now, Progress Estate, the neighborhood, the housing project, it was planned, built, and housed all of these things during 1915, shortly after the outbreak of the First World War. It was built in haste, but still under the general guidelines of the Garden City movement, which was quite popular at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And the attempt was to build, to provide better housing for the munition workers of the nearby Woolwich Arsenal factory. I will not talk more about I will not be long with my presentation about this study, because I will also present it in 2 weeks from now in the Young Researchers Forum. So if you find this to be utterly boring, then you know which meeting you want to skip. But I do want to give some of its main outcomes, and I want to focus upon the production of space, the philosophical work of Henri Lefebvre. The production of space, according to Lefebvre, is the result, among other things, of the interaction between those who plan the space and those who use the space, the architects and the residents, planners and users of space. The planners of Progress Estate wanted to use the space given to them in the most sufficient way, while still providing suitable housing for the workers and keeping the general feeling of the English country, with lots of the natural feeling. And one of the architects even called it the intention. He said that the intention was that it will look as if it had grown and not merely been dropped there. This is the outline of the housing project, and you don't need to be an urban planner to look at this aerial map of Progress Estate and see its distinguished design. The red lines marks roughly the contour of the western and eastern side of the estate, and the blue line marks the main road, Wellhall Road, which was the only part of this housing project that existed in the beginning of 1915. Only the road, of course, not the houses. The houses of Progress Estate are planned in adaptation to the irregular topography, to the space. This is what the town planner S.L.G. Buffoy referred to as production of harmonious composition in visual units, and therefore in accordance with the ideology of the Garden City movement, which says that the layout of the house should be arranged in conformity with the land. So, to sum up the intentions of the planners of Progress Estate in regard to building this housing project: quickness, efficiency, natural feeling. This is the goal. Now let's return to the users of the space, like Kathleen Biddlecombe. Kathleen and her family moved to Progress Estate because both of her parents worked at the munition factory, and they wanted to live closer to the workplace during the war. Kathleen, as a 14-year-old, took care of her younger brother and sister, and she did all the house chores, as she wrote in her diary on March 2nd, 1918. Mother and father are home for dinner. I cleaned stove and washed through the passage and kitchen. Now, because this housing project was built in haste, it did not have any stores in it. So she had to take the tram to Woolwich to do all the shopping. As she wrote on January 1918, I went to Woolwich today to buy margarine, but both shops were shut, and there are a lot of diary entries about her trips to Woolwich for shopping. Also, because it was wartime, Progress Estate, like other parts of London and Britain, was the target of aerial raids by airplanes or by zeppelins, and Kathleen wrote about it on 28th of January 1918. Air raid warnings were given. The Gothas, the airplanes, raided London, causing many casualties, and not till 1:45 till the all clear go. We all flew to dugouts under the table. Also, because all the residents of Progress Estate had moved there during the war, Kathleen didn't know many boys and girls, and she didn't have any friends there. And she often wrote about it also in her diary, like another entry from January 1918. Mr. Perkins, our neighbor, moved today. I do hope someone new moves in, as I want a friend. Now, what can we learn from Kathleen's diary about the space of Progress Estate in relation to the dialogue between planners and users? I think most of all is that because it was planned during the war, it was planned for the duration of the war. The proximity to the munition factory was the main characteristic of this housing project, at least in its early days. And it did not necessarily suited the war experience or the war needs of those who were not part of the war industry, like children. And I will talk more about it 2 weeks from now if you want to join and be a bit more bored. So to conclude this presentation, because I'm already way out of my limit, I want to conclude with the concept of expectation. The idea behind studying the interactions between people and space, whether in times of crisis or not, is seeking for the expectations of people from their space. People who live in liberal states, like Rudolf Rocker, expect the state not to enact spatial violence upon them, at least not without a trial. People who live under what they consider to be an unjustful occupation, like Nathaniel Lynn Moore, does not necessarily expect the same, but they see another layer of meaning in the space that surrounds them. They see the space as part of their own mission to free it in a way. And people who are part of their war economy expect, even without knowing so, that their privileges of civilians, like stores, schools, friends, they will be kept. And all what I said is, everything I said is not it's not part of a legal discourse, but it's a rather historical one, and from a spatial prism. But I think we can learn from it also about the way people perceive the concept of law and of civil rights and the expectations of civil rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asaf. It was really very interesting to get into your head, which is very different perspective from the perspectives that we usually talk about concentration camp or war or extreme condition. But I want to press you a little bit with the first question, and those who want to ask, please raise their hand or write in the chat. There is no doubt that space is a crucial factor in history. But you didn't really touch about the specifics. What does space do? And I want to invite you to conduct an exercise. Let's say that Rudolf Rocker would have been taken to internship in Masra. Natan Yellin-Mor would have taken into custody in Alexandra Palace. What would this inverted space exercise would have changed? In what way would history be changed? So in essence, the question, there is no doubt that space is a crucial factor, but in what way, in what effect space plays a role in history?
Okay, so I think usually in history don't have too much opportunities to answer the question what if. But specifically in this case, I think I do have an answer, because some civilians of enemy origins, like Rudolf Rocker, were taken to Alexandra Palace or camps like that in the midst of cities. Basically, there were other prisoners in Alexandra Palace that lived in the nearest street next to the palace before they were imprisoned. But also there were others who were taken to the Isle of Man. So they were really separated from their usual surrounding. And it was like, it was a real prison in a way. And what I saw is the main difference between the experience of those in Alexandra Palace and the others who were taken far from their house is, I can say maybe about, well, first of all, it's not only the prisoners, it's also the people who lived in London and saw the internment camp, the concentration camp, and the general feeling of an unjust imprisonment, whether by those who were imprisoned and by those who looked at them. I think it grew even stronger when it was within the city. So it definitely changed the way the government had to treat those prisoners. She did not, by not hiding them in a way, they had to deal with the problem and suffice them with better conditions sometimes lesser conditions, depending on the camp. And so I do think it had an actual effect on the experience of being a prisoner there. I didn't think about it in terms of what would happen if Natan Yellin-Mor would be kept in Britain, but I think about it. I think his own quotes from his memoir do tell something about the importance of being a prisoner in the land that you consider yourself to be a freedom fighter for. So I think before that he was kept a bit in Syria, but I don't remember something with special importance about his time there. I hope it answers part of your question.
Deborah, please, the floor.
So, Asaf, first of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed you brought these people alive, and you brought the spaces alive. I think it was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So we talked about people and space, and not a lot about context, but it's clear that context is critical here. But let's talk. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about the linguistics of it. I mean, the premise is that there are many different types of concentration camps. And here we had detention centers, estates, palaces, and also, by the way, how was Progress Estate? That was voluntary, right?
Yes, of course. It's not
That was
it's not a prison,
vol-
it's not a camp. It's
right.
just
That was voluntary in order to be in proximity.
yeah, it was
So-
more than voluntary. It cost a lot to live there.
Okay. So how do you combine them? I mean, for me, it was fascinating in terms of the connection between people and how they perceive their spaces. But I'm not quite sure how from there we go to the analogy of concentration camps.
Okay, so I think the analogy between or my my attempt to explain why Alexandra Palace should be called a concentration camp is part of it's a wider dialogue not between me and Rudolf Rocker perhaps, but between me and other scholars of the camp system basically, which is a bit of a much later experience. And I can say a few words about the decision to call Alexandra Palace a concentration camp. Basically, the term concentration camp was used by the British for camps in Africa. It was even used by Spain before that, and Germany in Africa. So it's a very old term, and the general feeling towards that the term concentration camp was changed dramatically after the Second World War. So if we are looking at levels of physical violence, or levels of how big of a disaster was it, then of course concentration camps is something that the Nazis did and the Soviets did in the gulags basically, and maybe China is keeping some of them today, but the British did not do such things, and Israel doesn't hold concentration camp and nothing like that. But if you're looking at concentration camp from a spatial prism, then you say, oh, okay, what's the main definition of it? What is the reason that this camp is a concentration camp and this one is an internment camp? And apart from the violence, which is perhaps important, but it's really hard to define, I think it's basically the same thing. You're taking people from their homes, keeping them in a place that is excluded from their from society. What is called forgot the word, but a space of exception, basically. So that is for the use of definition. But regarding Masra is a bit more problematic because it contains several types of prisoners for a basically very short time, only 3 years, and some of them, some Palestinians, some Jews, some convicted felons, some just were basically civilians of enemy origin. So at least now, because I'm still at the beginning of this research, I still call it a detention camp, as they refer to it, but I need to know more about it before I think of what's the right way to call it, I think.
Gadi. Gadi, you have to open your mic.
Thanks very much, Asaf. I want to ask you 3 questions. It's certainly a very interesting topic. Firstly, what have been or had been the ramifications of those detention camps after the war? So if we are talking about the First World War, the detention camps in 1915, what have been the trajectories on development of civil rights in England or Britain after 1919? Is it part of your project? Second question about your methodology. Are you doing a microhistory? And if you are doing microhistory, why? I mean, it's certainly very valuable, but there are other techniques of historical research. And lastly, could you talk more about the contribution of your project? Is it about undocumented stories? Is it about telling us more how to conceptualize emergencies? If you can talk about it more.
Okay, thank you. Well, regarding what happened to the camps after the war ended, at least in Britain, some of the camps were used also in the Second World War, but they were mostly forgotten. Alexandra Palace, for example, it was built in 19th century as an amusement park, basically. It was called the People's Palace, and after the war, it returned to its origin purpose. And in the 30s, it became the base of the BBC, the first ever live broadcast TV was from there in 1936, I think. But that's off topic. I don't actually work on the history of the camps themselves for the camps after the war, but rather on the history of the internees, the prisoners after the war. I have a side project with my supervisor from Tel Aviv, Professor Riz Rachamimov, about families of civilians of war internees after they were released. But that's I did not talk about it today, but that's something I also do. Regarding the microhistory, despite the way I presented the stories today, I'm not trying to make a microhistory. Even the opposite. I'm trying to say something about the place of such camps in the global history of camps, because even researchers like Andrea Pitzer that I mentioned earlier, or other great historians like Mahon Murphy and another one, I forgot his name at the moment, but his book is really important. They often try to not to speak as much about those camps as part of the global history of and the long history of concentration camps. So if there's anything I'm trying to do is to say it is part of a larger story that we need to tell ourselves. And your third question, can you remind it to me? I think you're still muted.
What might be the theoretical or the conceptual or the generic conclusion from your research?
Okay.
Unclear, where would you like to take it?
Okay, so thank you, and sorry for getting this part. Today I presented 3 parts of 3 different things I worked on or am working on, and I think the outcome of the presentation today is not that mind-blowing, at least not in terms of spatial history and urban history, but I do, in a more general, what I talked about Kathleen Biddlecombe and Progress Estate is part of a special issue I'm editing with Professor Inbal Ofer from the Open University about basically spatial history in times of crisis. And I think this is what I did not speak about it in length today, but if there's something that really interests me at the moment, and I'm trying to really look into it, is the general question of what is a spatial crisis? What makes what are the definition of a crisis as part of its space, and how do we define it, and how do we analyze it? So maybe that's a bit more close to the answer you were hoping for.
Thanks, Asaf. Amnon, please.
Thank you. This is really fascinating, and I'm also, I guess my question is a bridge between Deborah's question and Gadi's question. So the idea is that you seem to suggest that there is something that is called the spatial crisis, that is a crisis that exists in space. And part of the reaction of society to this is to generate states of exception or spatial, where is it? I think this is very interesting, but I think we would like, it's so interesting that we'd like to hear more about it in the sense of what makes something into a spatial crisis that is it connected to other type of crises? What makes something a spatial crisis? Some crises not spatial, while other crises are clearly spatial, and how to think about what makes this into a crisis, okay? And then the idea of the definition of a concentration camp. So you talked about the violence, and of course this is a major issue, but in terms of the purposes, so I guess part of it is the actual space that you set aside, and part of it is a purpose. So there is the notion of what is it there for? Now it could be there for just because you create a space because there's a flood. So you need to evacuate people, and you build a tent city or something, and you create it's a spatial crisis because there's flood. So you need to, or in Africa you have a wave of refugees, right? So you create a refugee camp, and that's a special. It's a reaction to spirit, but so this purpose really matters. Yes. The idea is not just to set people apart in a concentration camp. The idea is, and not just because it depends whether you want to protect them or you think they are dangerous or you want to protect society from them. But also I think the idea has to, for a concentration camp to be a concentration camp, the idea is that it's not just it's a state of exception, but they don't belong. They are a foreign element, and therefore in a way they don't belong. So I think we need more conceptual work that tells something about detention camps and about the ghetto. Ghetto is also, setting something apart from, and the concentration and the refugee camps in Africa or in Jordan or in other places. And the last point I want to raise here is the relationship to the rule of law.
Sorry?
To the rule of law.
Oh, okay.
So in previous works, we've addressed this phenomena that you of course conceptualize way better than we do, because this is your field. So we heard wonderful, very interesting stories about what happens in refugee camps, for example, with respect to the rule of law. So this notion of a state of exception is not just a space of exception. The idea that there is a state of exception with respect to a different legal system within this space. So maybe you want to tie this into the conceptual definition and therefore somehow explain it. But I don't know whether it's helpful, but at least for me, it was a bit missing from that perspective.
Yes, it's definitely missing in my work, and I'm trying to edit, but I'm not sure how. But I'm trying to work on a way to better understand the rule of law as a part of it. But I want to go back to the first thing you said. I agree with everything you said, and we do need to better conceptualize the concept of camp, basically. Before we discuss what is a concentration camp and an internment camp and a detention camp, what is camp? What makes one closed area deserve to be called like that and others do not? But I want to go back to the first thing you said about what makes a crisis spatial and what not. And that's a very good question, which I'm working on really these days, because we are trying, in Bal and I, we are trying to conceptualize the concept of a spatial crisis. And basically not, I'll answer with a question. A housing crisis, is it a spatial crisis or not? In one way, it is the definition of a spatial crisis, because it's a crisis and it cannot be more spatial than the lack of space or places to live in. But in others, you can also say that spatial crisis is not, housing crisis is not a spatial crisis, because it does not refer to a crisis within the urban space or the urban sphere, but rather to a lack of housing. So we are trying to think about, basically the best definition we reached so far is that a spatial crisis, or an urban spatial crisis, is when the natural flow of the city has to stop for some reason or another. Now, it's very general, but it does represent the way we think about urban spatial crises. And for the question and what you said about the rule of law and camps, I'm taking this into consideration, of course.
The floor is still open, but let me follow up on Amnon's question. You know, we talked about before about internship, detention, concentration, and I think the actual interesting part is the definition of the camp. Because you started with this example of you with your baby daughter exploring the 500 meters around you. It was also a camp for you because you couldn't go out. And I cannot stop thinking about the equivalent Asaf, who tries to walk with his 3 months old daughter in the streets of Kiev today. The camp is something of closure of movement, or restriction of movement in a time of exceptional times of war or disaster or natural disaster. And the question then is if you can try to characterize the difference in various camps in which people are captured. Either, you know, they are interned or detained, or that the circumstances are that they cannot leave this specific area, or that, you know, for some other reasons. And then the space element of the analysis will be interesting in sense of different types of why people cannot leave their camp. And this can be a very interesting kind of direction to implement or look at the uniqueness of the spatial element in exception or crisis or extreme conditions.
It's of course a very wide, a very big question that I will not be able to answer in a few minutes talk, but I think one way to look at it is to say I separate between conceptual camp, like I don't know, the imagined camp I walked with my daughter, and camps like Alexandra Palace or even Bergen-Belsen. And one way to separate between those two two systems of, two ways of seeing a camp is with barbed wire, which is one of the most important, horrific, but important ideas and materials of our last 200 years. Because when you separate between people with barbed wire, and basically you are not just segregating them, but you're also preventing them from leaving the place. And when you do so, not as a result of a trial or as a way to punish them because of something they did, but rather to punish them because of what they are, then I think you can get together different sorts of camps and say, okay, this is one group of camps that I found to be unique. Basically, not being able to live, being excluded from society, not just from, because if you are in prison as a civilian, you did something you weren't supposed to do and you were sent to prison, you are not taken out of society in the same way that you are taken out of society when you are sent to a camp because of your origin, nationality.
Maybe another interesting distinction would be your familiarity. You started with the example of you exploring the 500 meters around you. You didn't know them. Yes. But sometimes, you know the environment very well, like Rudolf, right? Who was interned in his environment. He knew the environment very well, and then you discover it under extreme conditions. Okay, assume that you grew up in this area of Givatayim, and you knew every corner of this 500 meters. This would be a very different experience of camp than your experience of exploring or in an introduction to a new area. I don't know what does it mean for history, but it's an interesting distinction.
No, but you can speak, but the same way you speak about the way space changed the urban experience or the crisis, then the crisis also changed the experience of space. So even if you knew the place before, then it's not the same space anymore.
Just a quick follow-up on this exchange. I think it has to do with the notion of belonging and the relationship between space and belonging, which is part of, I think, what you're trying to get at in ways that when you are put in those kind of camps, it's not just that you cannot go out. It is your whole belonging to the out is put in question, because you happen to be here, but you actually don't. The relationship between space and society is disrupted in a sense that you're not supposed to be here. So we're containing you or whatever, keeping you apart from others. Because from a social perspective, the linkage or the network, the social network is such that we want to sever it. To the extent it exists, we want to sever it spatially. So it has to do with belonging and the relation between space and belonging from that perspective. This is one comment I want to suggest. And also, I'm not sure, again, you talk about the flow in the city is disrupted. I'm not sure. I mean, I wonder to what extent it is helpful to concentrate only on urban spatial crisis, because I would think it's even harsher if people are put in Cholot, because then they're taken outside of the urban and put in the desert, so that the urban is not disrupted. So you take them away from South Tel Aviv and you put them in Cholot. And from your definition, crisis resolved. There's no urban spatial crisis anymore because the flow is the flow. But the whole point is that there is an internment just in the desert. So I would put a question mark on that.
It's something that we need to work on, but I think my best answer is that the definition of Cholot is as a space that it is unurban in its essence. Meaning it's also part of an urban crisis or urban speciality, because it is unurban in its essence. It's not just, it is outside the urban sphere. So it is part of this discussion.
So Amnon and I were pulling to different directions, which can be actually tied together. You know, the fact that the camp can be something that you are extracted to from your own environment, and a camp can be also something of a change in your environment that you know very well. And actually, you know, the stories from Ukraine, Kiev, the contemporary stories, of how people actually try to organize themselves in different neighborhoods. And it's very difficult to move from one neighborhood to another because everybody is, you know, a suspect. And this also a major change in space without the fact that people were taking out of their home space to another camp. So I think that, you know, that the kind of tensions between Amnon's remark about extracting people out to a camp and the fact that people's space changes, their own space changes, and this creates a camp, is an interesting direction to further study and insights.
Of course, no doubt.
Any other comments or questions? So thank you very much, Asaf. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to hear more of you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
תודה לכם.